Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and we're back again with another random-ass anime review. And today we're taking a look at a 25-episode series from 2001 called Kaze no Yojimbo, which translates to Bodyguard of the Wind. And this one is considered as a mystery drama, and one thing that is very interesting about this one is that the creator of this show was heavily inspired by an old Japanese film from the 60s called Yojimbo, and it has a very similar premise to this, but only that this show takes place in the modern day, where in Yojimbo it takes place in the 1800s. Unfortunately, I never got around to seeing the movie. I did wanted to watch it. In fact, I actually knew about it before knowing about this anime, but I'm sure I'll get to it eventually. So now, with that being said, let's get talking about the story on this one. So it stars our main character, George Kodama, and he's one of those main characters who kinda acts like a gruff, tough guy, but deep down, he does care about those around him. He's kinda similar to other characters that I really like, such as Domon from G Gundam, Yuri from Shadow Hearts, and Ryoto from Grandia 2. Though I don't think he's as over the top as those characters that I mentioned, but he does remind me of them in certain aspects, and I kinda like that. So anyways, he happens to go to a small town called Kimijuku, where he is looking for a man named Genzo Araki. So while he's looking around town for this guy, he ends up getting stuck between two different factions that are at war with each other. So one of them is Tanakura, who happens to be the rich noble type with a lot of money, and then the other one happens to be Samakichi Shirogane, who's pretty much your typical mob boss, and they have the whole brotherhood thing going on. So when George Kodama ends up getting involved with the two, he's sorta like a middleman where he does some odd jobs for both of the characters, but at different times, and then of course he wants to get to know them more. And as things escalate quickly as it goes on, of course there becomes a whole mystery within the town, for that it does secretly connect to something that George Kodama is looking for. And that is the basic premise of what I can give without going too much into it, because yes, there's a lot of stuff I could talk about with this one, but it's kinda hard to talk about it without going into spoilers. And yeah, I know this anime is over 20 years old at this point, but you gotta remember, not everyone can watch everything as soon as an anime comes out. I mean, hell, I'm watching this anime for the very first time in 2023, and I didn't want it to get spoiled for me. But before I move on and start talking about other things, I guess there's two other characters that I feel like that I should mention, for that they are pretty important, for that there is a character named Raccoon, and no, he is not literally a raccoon, in fact he's actually quite the opposite, where he's a big fat guy who's bald, and he's kind of like the more comic relief character, so to speak, like he's kind of goofy and always down on his luck all the time. And then there's the daughter of Tanakura, who happens to be Mayuki, who happens to take some interest in George Kodama after he rescued her. And that's all the ones I'm willing to talk about. Obviously, there is more characters that are also just as important and do add some contribute to the story, but I think this gives you a good general idea of what it's all about. And besides, I mean, do you really want me to just go down every single character in this entire show, including ones that only appeared in one episode? No, I don't think you would. So now, let's get moving on to the other things, like the animation. And sadly, I have to say that the animation in this one is not very good at all. I wouldn't even say it's mediocre, but it's not the worst thing I've ever seen. This is no Beast Fighter Apocalypse level bad, but it's definitely not good. But before we get to the bad parts of it, I gotta mention a couple nice things. For an example, I have to say, I do kinda like George Kodama's design. Sure, it's nothing over the top and crazy unique, but I just think it's just a nice simple design. Just give him a cool jacket, cool hat, and I also find that he himself kinda looks like a mixture between Banagher Lynx from Gundam Unicorn meets Ryoma from Getter Robo, but only if you tone down his eyebrows by 20 notches. But yeah, I kinda like the design for what it is, and then the only other character that really is recognizable and memorable looking is really just Raccoon because of his size and he just happens to wear bright yellow. But every other character is, yeah, pretty average looking and nothing too crazy to say, but that's the nicest thing I can say about the animation on this one. But as for the animation flow itself, yeah, it's pretty rough. Not only is there many scenes and many background characters that have, no animation to them whatsoever, but even when there is some slight animation, it does look pretty janky. And as for the fight scenes, oh man, there's barely much animation going on throughout most of them. Like, most of them just consist of slow motion panning across the screen and just have some, like, weird, like, Matrix type thing, and it just does not look good. But I will go out and say that there is one action scene towards the end of the series that does have some decent animation going on for it, but it happens so late in the series, and at that point, you're just like, wow, this is where all the budget must have went into. And even then, it's not even that amazing looking, but okay, one extra thing I do have to say about the animation before I move on is that this is another one of those shows from the early 2000s that uses a lot of 3D stuff, and yeah, it does not look good in this show. So all the different vehicles, like your trains, your cars, and your helicopters, yep, they're all done in 3D, and they do not look good, and there's a lot of just random background shots that also do look 3D as well, and they just really stand out, and it just does not look good. So yeah, that's all I have to say about the animation. You can tell it was very low budget, and unfortunately, they did not utilize it in a way where they could have at least made it look decent. So now, let's get moving on to the show's music. And wow, thankfully, I can say this is actually a good one, because damn, the OST for this show is actually pretty great. So you got a pretty good variety of different songs. So you got some good piano tracks, some good guitar tracks, and then you got some good harmonica tracks. Like, you got some good variety, and they all fit this show really well. They really fit the atmosphere of a small town, and it just sounds really good. And as you would expect for a show like this, there's a lot of songs that sound very mysterious and intense at times, which I do really like. But probably my favorite song out of the whole show, and this took me by surprise when I first heard it, there are some songs that play throughout some of the action scenes that are such a banger. So the one action theme that I really love a lot in this show has some really kick-ass guitar riffs in it. In fact, it kind of reminds me of a song that you would hear in Super Smash Bros. Melee. And to be specific, it reminds me of the ones from F-Zero that were redone for that game, which is a great thing to be compared to. So I guess the reason why that this song is so fire was because it was supposed to make up for the fact that the animation scenes are just not done very well. But either way, overall, it's a very good OST that I think is just really great, and thankfully, someone did upload them onto YouTube, so I'm glad for that. But as for the opening and ending themes, they're not my favorite, I'll be honest. Yeah, so even though as much as I love the background music within the show, I do find that the opening and ending themes, they're not my favorite. Now, they do fit the show for that they do kind of have this upbeat acoustic track, and I don't mind the way how that whole aspect sounds. The thing about it that I don't like about it is the singing. Yeah, whoever sang these songs, they just happen to have this, like, really annoying, whiny tone to it that I just really don't like it at all. If the song was instrumental, I think it would be a lot better, to be honest. So now let's get moving on to the show's voice acting. And yes, I can actually say shit about this one because I did watch it in English. Because it seems like most animes that I've been covering lately don't have English at all. Which I don't have a problem with, but, you know, it just gives me more stuff to talk about, and I just really like talking about voice acting stuff. So the main character is voiced by Michael Lindsay, and I have to say, this was a pretty different role for him, at least from ones that I remember watching of him, and I actually kind of liked him as him. In fact, his voice in this show kind of reminded me of Yuri from Shadow Hearts 2 a little bit, for that it was kind of like dark and kind of rough and tough. Yeah, I found it was quite fitting. It's just a shame that Michael Lindsay passed away a couple years ago, because I actually thought he was a pretty good actor. But as much as I liked him though, I think that the two best roles in my opinion had to be Kirk Thornton and Steve Bloom playing the two brothers at the Shirogane faction. Yeah, I thought they were the best part in my opinion. And then Miyuki was voiced by Melissa Fawn, and she was pretty good at first, but one thing that is unfortunate is that way later in the series, she was replaced by Rebecca Forstad and sounded really different, so it was kind of weird that she was recasted in the middle of the show. I don't know why that was, I couldn't find any information on that. But despite the middle change there, she did pretty good. But one last role that I do want to go over, and this is for a character that I haven't even talked about, was Richard Consino's character, which happens to be Rin Shirogane. This was another role that I thought was very different for him, for that this character was like a complete psychopath, and I don't think I've ever heard Richard Consino play one of those characters. I mean, yeah, he has played some villains before, which he was good at doing, but not like a character like this, and I actually thought he did it pretty good. But yeah, that's all I'll, like, majorly go over, and I can definitely say that the voice acting overall in English is really not that bad, and keep in mind, this is done in 2003, which I feel like is the year where English dubs were really starting to get a lot better. Not all of them, but a lot of them were starting to get better ever since the whole Cowboy Bebop thing happened. So yeah, all the main cast and all, like, the secondary characters, they were all done pretty well, and I don't really have any major complaints about them. If I really had to nitpick about anything, it's really just some minor casts were a little bit flat. But they're very few and far between, and like I said, it's really just nitpicking at that point, so I won't make a huge deal about it, but I figured I'd mention that, yeah, like, there is some minor roles that aren't the best, and you know what? That's okay. I'm just glad that they at least got the main cast right. But I suppose there's a little added bonus that I looked up that I thought was interesting to mention, is that in Japanese, the main character in the show is Hiroki Harada, and he also played the main character within Tiger and Bunny, and that's pretty great because that show's awesome. But okay, now let's get moving on to my overall thoughts, and I can say that Kaze no Jimbo is a pretty damn good show. Yeah, I actually really like this one. I thought the story and characters were really interesting throughout, and I think they did a pretty good job stringing you along, like, throughout the whole mystery. For that, I found that the pacing in this show was not that bad. Like, I can understand, like, maybe the beginning couple episodes, like, maybe are a little bit slow, but I feel like that they do give you enough interesting things going on to keep you going. And the more episodes you put into it, the better it gets, I think. But one thing to keep in mind is that, one thing that I do have to explain real quick, without spoiling anything, is that, remember when I said that the main character, George Kodama, like, his whole motivation is that he's trying to look for Genzo Araki? Well, I never explained why. Well, there's a reason for that, and that reason is that the character himself doesn't even explain the reason why until, like, much later in the series. Pretty much when the series is almost done. So the reason I bring this up is that I can see a lot of people that, like, are really impatient and they'd be like, "Tell me! Come on, do it now!" Yes, because impatient people turn into Arnold all of a sudden, but okay, with all joking aside though, yeah. You kinda just watch more episodes and you don't really get a lot of answers to things right away, so that's what I mean that, yeah, there are certain things about this show that I can see some impatient people not really liking about it. But I personally like the pacing of it, for that it did kind of keep me going, and they did have some interesting situations going on throughout it, and like I said, I thought the characters were at least interesting and very likable, and you kind of got to know them pretty well. In fact, I actually really liked the relation between George and Raccoon. And I also found that this show did have some pretty interesting twists that I thought were quite good and surprising, but of course I'm not going to get into that. And the show is only 25 episodes long, and honestly, I think it flew by pretty quick for me. And one other thing I do have to mention real quick is that I did found that when I was watching this show, there were certain aspects about it that did sort of remind me of another show I watched fairly recently. And that happened to be Master Keaton from Naoki Urasawa, though I didn't review that one, I just watched it on my own time for funsies. But yeah, there was a couple things about the two shows that did kind of remind me of each other, and I thought it was kind of neat. So yeah, overall, I would recommend this show for the most part. It's just the thing you gotta keep in mind is that it does have some pretty janky animation that is probably the worst part about this show, so if you can put up some janky animation with a pretty good story, then yeah, I would recommend it. But I do wish that they did some sort of remastered version where they happened to rework a lot of the animated stuff that could have been improved upon, because I feel like this show definitely deserves one. And I will end this review off and say that I actually would be curious on checking out that original film from the 60s. Like, I've always known about it, but now it makes me even more curious about checking it out.